Good morning. I hate to lead off. But you know what? I had you at your freshest. The worst time is right after lunch. Have you noticed that? So I got you good here. We're going to go over a program this morning that is going to give you some tips, but it's mostly going to teach you a process. And a lot of times when we're asked to come up with a design for our garden, we don't go about the process in the best way to organize our thoughts and our efforts and to make sure that what we end up with is going to be exactly what the client was looking for. And so this is a looking at the landscape design process. But that's not enough, because a lot of times you can learn that, look at it, and it just doesn't mean a lot to you. So for this program, I moved into a house at Adger's Point back in the 1980s, before many of you were born, and I documented what I went through when I came up with a landscape design. And so after showing you the process, we're going to take a look at how that process is applied to a real life situation and see what you get up with. So just to give you a brief introduction, your landscape design combines art and science. The art is the design part. You know, the beautiful things that you're trying to build into it, the color, the shape, the forms, how the beds all flow together, but it's also a science. Choosing the right plants to grow in the right location, preparing the beds properly, planting them properly. These are all based on science. We want the landscape to be functional, and so oftentimes we think about how beautiful a landscape should be. Of course it should be beautiful, but we forget the fact that it's functional. If you're going to do an interior design for a living room, you don't want a living room that's going to be beautiful. You want a living room that's going to be beautiful and function properly for the needs of the family. Our landscapes are no different. We use our landscapes to do things. They have a function. And if we don't look at the function of the landscape that we're designing, we may miss some of the needs of the family. So the design process takes that into account as well. And of course, we want it to be beautiful, aesthetically pleasing. We want it to meet the needs of the family, and that is so important. If you try to do a design for somebody without asking what their needs are, then you may not satisfy the needs that they actually have. And then finally, we have to take into consideration the home and other structures, because the landscape design has to do well with those. All right, so in this whole situation, proper planning is really important, especially if you're dealing with smaller space areas. The choice of building materials needs to be looked at, the choice and placement of plants and textures, shapes and colors. You've got to look at the flow of traffic. If you're designing a landscape where there's going to be people moving through it, how are they going to move through it? How do you want them to move through it? We use different parts of a landscape to do different things. We may have a patio area, a vegetable garden area, a swimming pool area, a kids' play area. It goes on and on. Every family's needs are unique, but we do those things in different areas, just like the rooms inside of a house have different functions. Different areas of the landscape may also have different functions, and all of these are matters of concern. And in a smaller landscape, this becomes incredibly important, because we're looking at a limited amount of space, so every square inch counts. You've got viewers that are very close to the landscape design, to the beds, to the plants. And so rather than looking at it from the street in smaller space situations, you're looking at it very up close. And so the details really make a difference. So one of the first steps in creating a landscape and getting your design going is to come up with the style. And this forms sort of the foundation, the guiding principle behind what you're going to develop in your landscape design. There are three basic styles: naturalistic or ecological, informal, and formal. The most popular is informal. We tend to move in that direction. Americans like informal style landscapes. But here in the New Orleans area, there's a long history of formal landscape design. And so formal landscape elements creep into landscapes quite a lot. Adds a lot of maintenance, but it is popular. Naturalistic has been the least popular, but it's gaining in popularity. People are looking at native plants and more naturalistic planting, pollinator gardens and butterfly gardens. These are all aspects of naturalistic or ecological style. And naturalistic makes use of native plants that are well adapted. And it tries to duplicate, not recreate necessarily, but duplicate the principles behind a natural setting like a woodland or a meadow or a pond. And we use these natural settings as the inspiration for these kinds of designs. I have a couple of acres in Prairieville that I garden on. This is the entrance to my woodland garden. You can see how casual and informal and naturalistic it is. There's not a great deal of structure, and yet there's enough plant materials and diversity to create interest. When I put flowers in that area, I oftentimes just would throw the seeds out into a prepared area, just let them scatter and grow in a drift. So you want things to look as if they happen naturally, even though they may be quite contrived and carefully planned. The effect you're looking for is something relaxed, as if it simply happened on its own. I have a pond in my front yard, and here's a shot of the end of the pond. And I've designed this to be very naturalistic looking at. They're muley grass, Louisiana irises, walled cypress, a big dog fennel plant that happened to sprout up on its own. I love the texture of dog fennel, it's very fine. And I thought, what would happen if I just let this grow here? And it made a really nice, fine mass. And that reddish large mass to the side, the sweet celosia. And so again, you see this has just a relaxed sort of a naturalistic look to it, and that's where the naturalistic style comes from. The informal style is also a relaxed style. It uses curving lines, little symmetry. Plants are allowed to develop their natural forms. It's lower maintenance and formal, and it uses casual building materials. Old brick or unfinished wood might be something you might see in informal style. Again, we're looking at beds that have curved edges to them. Relaxed, very nice, curved edges. This is not Louisiana. I think anybody who looks at this and say, that's not Louisiana, and it's not. But we could create gardens like this, y'all. We could create gardens that look just like this, just as colorful and just as beautiful if we wanted to, if we use the right kind of plant materials. But here, although these are lavish beds that we might not normally utilize, you can see the graceful curving lines that are the hallmark of an informal landscape design. Here's an uptown landscape that I just fell in love with. It happened to be a time of year when the tulips were blooming. And it's informal, although we have a lot of straight lines, which we don't oftentimes see in informal landscapes. The arrangement is very informal. Here you can see that the lawn area has been covered over with Asian jasmine, but pockets have been left open in the Asian jasmine that can be used to embellish the landscape. During the spring, the tulips look great. When they finish, the tulips will be yanked out. The crepe myrtles will leaf out, create shade, and caladiums could be planted in those areas. If you wanted something more colorful than tulips over a longer period, cool season bedding plants like dianthus or pansies could have been planted in there for the winter. So again, you don't see symmetry, you don't see balance, you don't see straight lines. You see something that's more casual and pleasing for that way. This is one of my favorite slides I love to show, just to illustrate a lot of the ideas that we're utilizing in informal landscapes. And this is an entrance garden. You can see that the building itself is informal. Old brick, exposed wood beams. So an informal front garden, front landscaped area was very appropriate. But look at how much was crammed into this little small area. There's color, because we all crave color. We got the yellow daylilies and the purple verbena. Somebody must have been rooting for LSU at this house, which would not be unusual in Baton Rouge. In addition, we have a variety of heights. We have the white buddleia, the Lord Pendulum over on the left, adding height. We've got different textures. The fine texture of the verbena, the upright sword-shaped foliage of the Louisiana irises, the coarse texture of the purple canna foliage over to the side. In repetition, we have the purple foliage of the canna echoing the purple foliage of the Lord Pendulum, bringing this whole composition together. When you see something that looks good to you, you can't learn from it simply by saying, I think that's beautiful. You have to be able to look at it with an eye that says, this works because. And if you understand why you think it's beautiful and why it works so well, then you can incorporate that and utilize those ideas and concepts. So here we've learned about height variations, textural variations, color that we all crave, and seasonal color as well, all crammed into this relatively simple little front garden that had a huge amount of thought go into it to create this particular effect. In the formal style, and again, we'll see lots of aspects of formal styles. We don't oftentimes see classic formal style landscapes and average suburban landscapes. We oftentimes see elements of the formal style. We have straight lines, geometric shapes, symmetry on an axis. We've got clipped formal building, we've got crisp formal building materials, milled wood, painted wood, and the plants are oftentimes sheared or clipped into geometric shapes. And again, because we're exercising so much control in the formal style, we are exercising maximum control over nature. And the more you try to control nature, the more effort it takes you to put into that. And so in the formal style, we are really have nature under control. We're clipping plants, we have everything in straight lines and bead edges, and to achieve that, it takes a lot more effort. Here's a classic formal garden. Again, notice the axis down the middle. There's a little fountain there at the end in the shadows. Everything on one side of the axis is repeated on the other side of the axis. That's the symmetry of it. I always said this is a good landscape style if you only want to use half your brain, because whatever you do on one side, you should do the same thing on the other side of the main axis. So if you design half of it, you have the other half already designed and ready to go. But look at the work involved in keeping those hedges nice and clipped and the bricks all swept. This is the parterre garden at the Botanical Garden in City Park. Again, the hallmark, the straight axes, the geometric shapes, the hedges clipped into formal forms, the centrally located fountain. A little small side garden, and again, you're seeing the hallmarks over and over again. Straight lines, symmetry and balance, and clipped hedges and controlled plant forms, the topiaries in the back, the standard topiaries. A little variation. This is located kind of to one side of the backyard, so it's not that classic, axis down the middle. But within this garden itself, you can see all of the aspects of a formal design. The topiary clipped plants, the clipped hedges, the axis and the balance. So that gives you an idea about the formal design. Courtyards, I think, just have a natural formality to them. This courtyard is not planted in a formal style. Notice how the plants have been allowed to grow to their natural forms, and there's not symmetry really, but that big dominant fountain in the middle and the square shape of the enclosed courtyard garden lends them an air of formality, whether or not you take advantage of that or not in your design. And sometimes just little aspects, just little clipped hedges. Again, when you see a little clipped hedge like this, it's a formal aspect of the landscape. And again, every time you put something like that in, you up the labor that's going to take to maintain that. So there's a process. Landscaping a little area is not a matter of walking up, looking at the area, and waiting for inspiration to strike you like a bolt of lightning. And all of a sudden, this gorgeous landscape design appears in your mind, and then all you have to do is follow it. It just doesn't work like that. Those people who are trained in design, landscape architects, go through a process. They don't wait for lightning to strike them either. There's a process that guides our human thought processes along step by step until we finally reach our goal, what we're trying to achieve. And so these are the basic steps in creating a landscape design. You've got to list the needs of the family or the people who will be using that landscape, because the landscape has to provide for those needs. You need to study the site so that you can understand how the design is going to properly fit into the site's characteristics. One of the first steps in doing the design is to draw a landscape use plan. And that is, I have this area to landscape, to design, and the family is going to be doing this, this, and this in this landscape area. So where are each of those activities going to occur? You can shift them around and play with them until you find an arrangement of use areas that fits well. And then you can just do a little quick sketch. Once you do the quick sketch, once you know where everything's going to take place, you have to begin to shape the spaces. What shape will the beds have? What shape and size will the vegetable garden be? What shape and size will the area around the pool or the jacuzzi be? What shape will the patio be? All of these have to be then shaped up, and then you select your materials, and in this stage, if we decided that we needed privacy on one side of our yard to block an undesirable view, if we then decided that we wanted to have a fence there, it's in this fifth stage that we select the fence material that we're going to be using. If you decided you needed shade in an area, you decided to provide shade with a tree of a certain size. It's not until this fifth step that you actually choose the tree that's going to provide the shade in that area. And too oftentimes, you just try to jump into the plants right away without going through these preliminary steps that help make sure we're guided to selecting the right plant. So when it comes to selecting materials, that's a little later in the design process than a lot of people actually will do. So here we are looking at some of the needs that you may be designing a garden for a family. Play area for the kids, they want shade, they want privacy, they love colors, they want some flower beds, they need an outdoor living area like a patio or a deck. Everybody needs a utility or work area where you're going to put the lawnmower, your tools, your fertilizer. So that has to be built into a landscape design as well. And just look at what you need. Every family, every situation is going to be uniquely different. If you're looking at environmental concerns, and you should be, you always want to also keep some things in mind. We have clients that in particular are interested in these aspects as well. Habitat for wildlife, food for wildlife, water for wildlife, minimizing maintenance and reducing runoff are all ecologically important goals that we need to have in our landscape designs as well. All right, then we're studying the site. How are you going to pick the right plants for the site if you don't know where the sun shines and where it doesn't shine? What areas receive what kind of light? So where is the drainage good? Where is the drainage bad? So you want to note the compass directions. That affects your light. And again, if you visit a site for a client and you're there for 30 minutes or an hour, y'all talking, how will you know what kind of light the different areas of that landscape receives? How will you know what area is full sun and what area is part sun or shade? You can't determine that in an hour visit. You just see a quick snapshot of what that yard looks like at that moment in time. So sometimes you have to guess, what kind of light does this area receive? The compass directions affect that tremendously because the sun rises in the east, sets in the west. We're perched up here on the northern hemisphere. So when we look across the solar system, the sun appears to be in the southern part of our sky. So the sun crosses from east to west in the southern part of our sky. Now what that means is for any large object, a house, a fence, a huge shrub, a hedge, for anything that casts up a shadow, a substantial shadow in the landscape, the northern side will be the shadiest, the eastern side will be part shade, the southern side, because the sun is in the southern sky, gets shined on all day, will be full sun, and the western exposure will be part sun. So even if you're not there all day long to watch the sun shadow patterns in a landscape, just knowing the compass directions and seeing where everything is, you know the north side of the house is going to be shady. The south side of the house is going to be sunny. It's just how it is, because that's how the sun travels across the sky. Look at the existing structures and things that you're going to remove or keep. Where's shade needed? Where's privacy needed? And also look at views from off-site. Don't just look at the site, but can you see the neighbor's yard? Does the neighbor have an eyesore that you need to screen? Or does the neighbor have this incredibly gorgeous flower garden that you're going to leave exposed because you can enjoy that without having to work on it? So think about all the things, and don't forget to look out windows as well, where you'll be viewing the landscape from indoors. Drawing a landscape use plan, I mentioned earlier, it's very simple. You can just sort of do a scale drawing or just a sketch of the area, and then just begin to play around where different activities are going to take place. Decide where and how much space will be allocated for the different activities, like a patio, a vegetable garden, a kid's play area. You can use just little simple circles to take a look at that. We call it a bubble diagram sometimes because of that. You can play around with it. It's all on paper. You can move things around, throw the paper away, but just get a feel for what makes the most sense for arranging these different use activities around the space then I'll be landscaping. Again, I mentioned shaping the space. At that point, you decide what shape the different areas will have, the shapes of beds, the shape of the patio or deck, how big is the vegetable garden going to be, decide on the characteristics of plants that you should be using, not the plants themselves, but just the characteristics. So if you know you want a shrub planting in this area, at this stage you're saying, well, I want a shrub that's going to be evergreen and bloom with pink flowers because the client likes pink, and let's bloom in the fall because we've got other plants that bloom in the spring built into the landscape. That's as far as you need to go at this stage. You just need to define what the plant needs to be, what characteristics are you looking for, so that plant will provide into that landscape design what you need it to provide. But don't belabor yourself with trying to come up with a name at this particular stage in the process. This is a creative process, and this is where people sometimes start tripping up. Everything else anybody can do. Here we get to the art part. At this point, the art part comes in. You've got to have that aesthetic movement towards the shape of the beds. And the style of your landscape really begins to come in at this point. Remember, if you're doing an informal landscape, the shaping of these spaces is going to be informal, curved lines, casual, no real symmetry. If you're doing a formal landscape at this stage, that's going to guide you. You'll be doing rectangular beds, circular beds, clipped hedges, plants that are formed in topiaries. So again, keep in mind that at this point the art begins to creep in, and this is where you're going to have to pull out those design ideas in your head. And then finally, we're selecting the materials. Way here, we're finally going to start saying, what kind of a shade tree do I want to plant? Because I know the shade tree I want to be right here needs to get to be 35 to 40 feet tall. I want it to be deciduous and drop its leaves in the wintertime. And the owner asked if it was possible to get some fall color because they're from up north and they miss the fall color of their trees. So my job now at this stage is to find a tree that goes to be about 35 feet tall, is deciduous, and has at least some fall color that we might manage to get down here. And at that point, you choose the trees that most closely matches those characteristics. You're not looking at every possible shade tree that you could plant there. That'd be confusing to think of. You're thinking about just those few trees that most closely match those characteristics. And the same thing goes for every ground cover, every vine, every shrub, everything you plant. First you think about what it needs to be, characteristic-wise, based on its function, how you want it to look, and then you try to find the plant material that most closely matches that concept that you have for what you want to plant and grow there. So here it is. We listed our needs, we studied the site, we drew a land use plan, we've shaped the spaces, we've selected the materials, then the installation comes, and then evaluation. You'll do some evaluation with the client, but then the client's going to be doing a lot of evaluation over time. Alrighty, so let's apply this to an actual process. Some of the needs that you might see from various families include these listed right here. Now, these are my personal needs. But I sat down to landscape my new house and it had no landscape. It had a little backyard, 30 by 30 feet. So when I say small space design, 30 by 30 feet. Now, I sat down and I listed what I needed that landscape area to do for me. What did I want to do in that area? Because the only way I could make sure everything I needed to have in that landscape was there would be for me to identify what it was I needed to do. So this was my list of what I wanted to put in that 30 by 30 foot backyard. A patio out for outdoor living, a greenhouse, storage, outdoor cooking, shade, privacy, an herb garden, color and fragrance, a water feature, and traffic movement, so that people can move around the landscape area that I was creating. So that was my personal list. So what I'm going to do right now is show you how I took what I just told you and applied it to my home in Algiers Point in the late 1980s, before many of you were born. If you see an old car in a picture, you know why. So here's the backyard. when I bought the house. There was a concrete slab with a ramshackle shed on it, and then just lots of just weeds and grass growing in the area. So I had a blank slate to work with. So I studied the site. I have a parking lot. I was surrounded by the LP&L parking lot. Lots of sun, good drainage, a base of river sand. The backyard had been filled with river sand. There was an existing shed, and it's a small area, just 30 by 30 feet. So that was a study of my site. And then here is a diagram of that space where I've done the bubble diagram. Where are you going to put everything that you want to have back there? Where are you going to have, you've listed your needs, so where are all those activities going to take place? And this just didn't pop up. I sat and sketched and drew and sketched and drew. I moved the patio around. I moved the herb garden around. I moved all kinds of things around. But this is what I finally ended up with. A patio, is this complicated? A patio right in the middle, centrally located. I needed to move traffic around the area, so I have little arrows indicating how I'd like to see traffic flow. I need privacy to the left-hand side where the parking lot was, and privacy to the right-hand side to block a neighbor's yard. I put an aquatic feature up by the back of the house. The bottom of the diagram is the back of the house. Those are two dark bars of the doors. There's an existing shed, and I intended that to make a winter greenhouse, an outdoor living area, and a storage area out of that. Outdoor cooking up in the back corner, shade on this side because that was to the west and I needed shade from the sun. Do you see how this applies? It's a process. It's easy to do if you take it a step at a time and don't just stand there waiting for a lightning bolt to strike you, because it's not, and you wouldn't want it to anyway. You go through this process step by step. We humans can break things down into small steps and achieve incredible things as a result. So here's the first little step in coming up. There's no design to this. There is no design per se here. I haven't shaped the spaces yet. All I have done is said, where do I want to put the different activity areas? But now I have to start shaping the spaces. And after playing around with a lot of different ideas and concepts, I settled on a formal structure. The house that I was moving into was built in the late 1800s, an old Victorian house, and formal landscapes were popular at the time, so that's where I took my inspiration. The patio is there in the middle. I think you'll see this better if I'll add some color showing you where the surfaced areas will be and where the planted areas will be. So this is very straightforward. Again, after playing around with a lot of things, I was surprised that this is just kind of simple, but it works well. There's an outdoor living area in the middle. There's a walkway around the outside that carries traffic all around the space in the area. And then there are little walkways that connect the circulatory sidewalk around the outside with the patio, with the outdoor living area. And all of the green is up for planting, and all of the gold would be a surface area. So after I kind of shaped that up, I started putting the uses back down into that. So I've shaped the spaces overall, and now I'm putting back in all of those things you saw in the bubble diagram based on where I said I wanted them to be. So I've got an 8-foot fence along this side of the house to block the parking lot, another 8-foot fence to block the neighbor's yard. You see the water features in the bed closest to the house. There's an herb garden close to, this was my back door. The house is a double. And so I wanted the herb garden very close to my back door so I could run out of the kitchen, harvest the herbs I wanted to cook with, and run right back in before the pot overboiled. So that's where the location of the herb garden got. The outdoor living area, the shed that's going to be a winter greenhouse with some outdoor living options and storage. And so you can see how once I had shaped the overall spaces of the design, then I put back in all of the locations for the different activities. This is a picture of the house. You can see it's a Victorian, which means it was built in the late 1800s or early 1900s. It's a East Lake, and that's because of all the filigree that you see, the spindles, the turned columns are all indicative of East Lake. It's a shotgun. You can't, the house is divided in half, so they're two equal parts. One side was rented out, and I lived in the other side, and it's a camelback. And being a shotgun, you could stand in the front door, and if you looked carefully, you could see out the back door. So that was how the house is. I had to take inspiration from this. Notice there's a wrought iron fence in the front, and brick. It was used for the walkway, that old brick there. So that gives you some idea where some of the inspiration came from. When it came time to select the materials for this garden, for my patio and walkways, I chose old brick because that matched the front sidewalk that was already there. For the shed, I chose clapboards, French doors, stained glass, wrought iron, and large shutters because that's what I saw on the house itself. And the shed and the yard needed to reflect the architecture of the main house itself. For the fence, I used columns and lattice to give that nice formal look. To shade the yard, I used yopon tree, Savannah holly, drake elm. For water feature, I picked out a pineapple fountain. For shrubs, I used dwarf yopon, ligustrum topiaries, Chinese mahonia, and others. But you see what I'm doing here. I'm beginning to choose the plant material that's going to achieve what I decided needed to be done when I was shaping the spaces. So I know I wanted an 8-foot fence for privacy when I'm shaping the spaces. When it comes to selecting materials, it's time for me to decide that fence is going to be columns and lattice. So here's the installation to show you how all of those ideas came to fruition. Here is me laying. I got a whole bunch of old brick from an old water plant that had been torn down and started laying the patio area. It's just laid on river sand with mortar mix, swept in and then watered in to set it. And so there you can see the square patio in the middle and the L-shaped beds around it that you saw in the diagram. Here next door, you can see the parking lot on the other side of the fence, and it's obvious then why I needed the privacy fence to block out that unattractive parking lot. Here's the fence going in, and again, because the overall style was formal, the fence looks relatively formal. Some old columns with lattice work in between them. And the fence was then softened with the planting of vines. The vines also increase the privacy. You can see through lattice work, which is what I wanted. The air can flow through, but the vines added a bit more privacy and softened the architectural feature of the fence. And so that's how the fence has turned out. I had to plant everything. You know, being a horticulturist here in New Orleans, having people call me about growing everything, I had to grow everything. So when people walked into my backyard and said, I see nothing by way of rhyme or reason here, it's just overflowing with everything, I said, that's because you're going to call me about how to grow something. If I haven't grown it, I'm not going to be able to talk to you about it. So when you see some of these slides, very diverse planting palette, although the bones of the landscape are formal, balanced, symmetrical, straight lines, the plantings that were done are exuberant, vibrant, colorful, and a lot more like cottage style gardening. So you don't have to wedge yourself to one style. If you want to, you can blend styles together as long as you can do it effectively and they both work well with each other. This was just a bunch of annuals I planted the first year. This was a shot in March or April. You can see cool season annuals blooming. The shed needed to be done next. Notice in this shot right here, you know, I have the camera angled so you can see the flowers, but you don't see this incredibly horrible, ugly shed here behind. And so that was certainly high on my list of things that I wanted to get done. Now it sat on, well maybe I should say it, maybe I shouldn't. It sat on the property line with the LP&O parking lot. You know how that goes in an old city like New Orleans. And you can grandfather in things that are not up to code. And building on the property line is not permitted. Absolutely not permitted. So if we tore the shed down and rebuilt a new shed, we would be against the code because we would be doing new construction and we'd be building it on the property line. So we did it. We had a fabulous carpenter and he took down one wall and rebuilt it, took down the next wall and rebuilt it. So it was never torn down at any time. It was just renovated, even though it was completely and totally rebuilt. Sometimes you have to finagle things. So here is the gradual tear down and rebuilding of the shed, and then that's how the shed turned out. So there's the shed now. I always called it the shed because we started calling it the shed, but obviously this is a really nice building. You don't always have to have your utility building look this nice and have this much time, effort, and money put into it. It can be in some out-of-the-way area that you don't notice that much, where you store your gardening tools and your fertilizers and your bags of mulch and whatever else you need to have stored. But this, again, in a small space landscape, was right there. It was a prominent part of the garden. And so again, you can see the aspects of the house: stained glass, French doors, big shutters, and the top is fiberglass, so that light shines into it. So during the winter time, I open those French doors and that old concrete floor, I just load all my tropicals in there and they get sun all winter long, and I put a heater in as needed, and I just water them. It's just a concrete floor. So again, that was how my greenhouse, the right-hand side of it, on the right-hand side of the French doors, was closed off and turned into storage for equipment, and then the part of the shed after that, during the summertime, when I didn't need it for plants, was an outdoor living area. And see, there's a little indoor living area, and just some more shots of the shed. I also had the patio area, which was a large square, but I didn't always need that much space. If it was just a few friends, a more intimate feeling was appropriate. And so I used abundant container plants on the patio area. And when I needed a more intimate feeling, the container plants gathered around, as you see in these pictures, softening and making the space more intimate. But if I had a big party and invited a lot of people over, all of those container plants would be moved out to outside areas, away from the patio, opening the patio up and giving lots more space for people to stand around and visit. So make your landscape as functional and versatile as you possibly can. And again, the plantings, as I told you, are eclectic, abundant, and a little of everything. But in a way that I hope was aesthetically pleasing. I'll never forget bringing a friend through the house. And remember, shotguns, you're walking from room to room to room. And there was no way to see the backyard garden from the house. The back of the house was a lean-to that was built in the 30s when indoor plumbing came in, and it had the bathroom and washrooms in them. But you couldn't see the yard until you actually opened the back door and walked out into the yard. And I remember bringing a friend through the house, telling her about the garden and describing a little bit. And when we got to the back washroom, and I opened that back door to reveal the garden, I opened the garden up and she took a step and froze. And I thought, I got her. She is so impressed with what I have created here. It stopped her in her tracks. And she looked around and she turned to me and she said, "Is this it? Is this your whole garden? You write the Times-Picayune garden columns, and this is all you have?" I said, "Well, I do a lot of work in the botanical garden in City Park too." So never get cocky. But I did try to make sure it was as beautiful as I could make it. Just a different shots of the yard. Again, lots of flowers, lots of different kinds of plants. There's the herb garden. I told you I had to have my herb garden. And back here, I went past in that upper right-hand corner, you can see the pineapple water feature. Remember that pineapple fountain I mentioned in my selected materials? Well, there's the pineapple fountain. But also notice the back of the house is a blank wall. You cannot see the garden. One of my big goals is, after I got the landscape done, was to create a garden room with French doors across the back of the house so that we could sit inside and actually enjoy the beauty of the garden. And indeed, we finally were able to get that done. And that's the garden. The last step was building the garden room so we could appreciate the garden from inside. And don't ever forget, when you're designing outside, that these spaces you're creating outside, this color and this beauty, these plants you're putting in, can also be appreciated from inside, especially in the summertime. We appreciate our gardens more sitting inside the air conditioning than we do outside. And so this was the garden room with the French doors across. I changed out the water feature, but look at the wrought iron gate. Again, wrought iron was part of the original architecture across the front of that house. it was a wrought iron fence, and that's where that wrought iron comes from. It's echoing what you would see in the front of the house. And then you evaluate, see how it all works out. Homeowners need to reevaluate their landscapes about every 15 to 20 years because they oftentimes need to be reworked and redone to some degree. Finally, let me just say that plants for when we're looking at plants for small spaces, just remember that size is so important. You have a limited amount of space to deal with. Whether it's a courtyard garden or a patio garden in a larger garden area, when you're focused on a smaller space, the plant materials have got to be in scale and proportion with the area that you're landscaping. So remember, when you go to the nursery and buy a plant, it's irrelevant how big it is when you buy it. Everything at the nursery is a baby. Everything at the nursery is a baby. That's why they call it a nursery. And if it's a baby, it's going to grow. If you want to go buy a puppy, go buy a puppy. But make sure you see the mama. And maybe the daddy. Because seeing that puppy that you're holding in your hand doesn't tell you anything about how it's going to be in a year, how big it's going to be in a year. So selecting a shrub in a nursery that's exactly the size you want that shrub to be when you plant it is wrong. Because it's not going to stay that size. It's going to get 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 times bigger than it is. So when you're selecting plant materials, you've got to look at the mature size. Because if you plant shrubs that get to be too big, you build tons of pruning into the landscape, and that increases maintenance. Now, if you want a formal landscape with all the shrubs clipped into geometric shapes, fine, you've made that decision. But if you put in an informal landscape with shrubs that are meant to be allowed to their natural shapes more, and then the shrub wants to be this big and you want it to be that big, then you have a fight for the rest of your life with that shrub. For the rest of your life. Or the rest of its life. Generally, we use plant species that are naturally small or compact in these small space areas, or smaller growing or dwarf cultivars. Now, there is a problem with the word dwarf. It means smaller than the standard. That's all dwarf means. It doesn't mean small. It doesn't mean the right size for your situation. It simply means that this cultivar is smaller than the standard way that plant grows. So Burford hollies grow to be about 15 feet tall. That's their standard size. They're a nice small tree. We don't use them much anymore, but they were very popular back in the last century. The Burford hollies get to be about 15 feet tall. So dwarf Burford hollies, and there is a dwarf form of the Burford holly that's very useful in landscapes for small hedges in particular. They get to be 5 to 8 feet tall. Now, how many of you would define a dwarf plant as being 8 feet tall? You wouldn't. You think, well, that's not dwarf at all. If it's smaller than the standard, and it is by half, then it's dwarf. So again, don't look at names. Look at sizes. Look at how big it grows to be on the label, and look how big it grows to be by doing internet research on it. You've got to know the mature size, and as much as possible, match the mature size of the plant with the size of the plant you want in that location. If you want a 4-foot shrub in a location, don't plant a shrub that wants to be 6 to 8 feet tall. You'll fight with it. Plant a shrub that wants to be 4 to 5 feet tall. Very important in landscaping in general, but particularly when you're doing small spaces. So, does an 8-foot tall plant seem dwarf to you? Alrighty, I have exhausted my time, so you have no time for questions. But I will hang around, and if there's something I can help you with, feel free to come up and say hello. Y'all, thank you for being a super audience.